Good morning. It's wonderful to be here. I'm not sure, for those of you who were here last night, congratulations to the 135 organizations that have been honorees for the world's most ethical companies. It was just such an incredible evening. I've personally been very excited for this panel. I'm going to take 30 seconds to introduce myself, and then I'm going to have my panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll get into the content. My name is Preston Clark. I'm the president of a global online education company called EVERFI. We focus on the hard issues globally, whether it's corruption, diversity, inclusion, sexual harassment, and we work with communities, corporations, schools in tackling these issues and measuring the impact. Diversity and inclusion in particular has been an area of focus for us. March 1st, we hosted the first, when we were just talking about this, Diversity and Inclusion Executive Roundtable in San Francisco, and we had diversity and inclusion leaders from companies like Uber and PayPal and Tesla come together in a conversation around diversity and inclusion and the initiatives that we instill within our organizations to build better organizations. And that's really the spirit of Ethisphere. I know that often we focus on ethics, but really what we're talking about is how we create great global organizations, and diversity and inclusion initiatives certainly play a critical role in that. The theme for today, the theme for the event that we hosted in San Francisco, the underlying theme of this conversation is that what Ethisphere has built and what this is about for us is a network and a community of people who, in the normal course of business, we're competitive and we're finding ways to succeed and grow our businesses and not necessarily always collaborating across industry. But on issues of diversity and inclusion, collaboration is critical. This is something that has societal value. It certainly has business value, but it's something that we shouldn't be holding back from each other. It's something we should be sharing. And so that's the spirit of today. And so to the same degree that all of you will walk out of this room and go to lunch and have conversations around the global ethics initiatives that you all are deploying within your companies, I would encourage you to listen to this great panel today and to take back conversations to the table that you can have with each other and with your peers and with your colleagues to make a better organization as it relates to this very important topic. I'm going to pass it along, and we'll go left to right here, my left to right, from an introduction perspective. We'll start, Oris, with you.
Well, thank you, and good morning. I, as the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer for the NBA, have responsibility for those topics in every aspect that they touch our business, whether it's the talent life cycle and our employees, wherever they exist in the world, at the league office, or across our 68 odd teams between the NBA, the WNBA, and the NBA G League, and actually 17 additional teams soon to be with the NBA 2K League. Also, I focus on things like our fan experience in our arenas, and just about anything else that has inclusion implications. Just by way of background, I had the perfect preparation to do this work as a software engineer and electrical engineer in my former life. And I was abruptly introduced to this whole notion of diversity and inclusion many years ago when on the second day of my job, back in the 90s, Fortune 300 organization, I got an invitation to get on a corporate jet and fly to corporate headquarters to meet with the Diversity Council. And so I did what they asked me to do. I showed up, and the second day of work, I'm sitting at the table with the chairman of the board, the CEO, and a bunch of the executive officers. And just a quarter of the way through the meeting, the chairman turns to me and says, "Oris, we're glad you're here. I don't know if you know this, but you are the most senior-ranking African-American at our organization. And so we have you here because we want to know what all the black employees are thinking about, what they need." To which I replied, this is only my second day. But that did introduce me to this important topic, and certainly for them it was an issue of the utmost strategic importance and started my journey, and I guess that goes back almost 20 years now, to diversity and inclusion. So really happy to be here with you and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Debbie?
Thank you. I'm Debbie Wright. I'm a New Yorker for the last 20 years or so. I grew up in the Deep South. Bennettsville, South Carolina was where I was born, and we moved to Dallas, Texas when I was 12. and came north to college and never went back home for some of the reasons that we'll probably talk about today, which is, the world is a fascinating place, and you want to live in a place and work in a place that reflects your values and your perspective on the world. Obviously, you want to grow as well. I ran a bank up in Harlem for 15 years. After a number of years in the public sector, I had the rare experience of working for David Dinkins and Rudy Giuliani, which we probably won't talk about today. And in the course of my time at running Carver, a man by the name of Dick Parsons, who was on the board of Philip Morris, called me one day and asked me if I'd like to be interviewed for Kraft Foods, which was owned by Philip Morris and was being spun out. And so that's how my board career began. So I'm going to stop here and say I'm thrilled to be here and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Eileen.
Okay, well, I'm Eileen Gordon, and I'm Executive Chairman of the Board of Ingredion, which I just assumed this position January 1st. I actually was CEO of Ingredion for 8.5 years. And it's been a great time being part of a great global company, Ingredion. And first of all, we're very thrilled to be recognized by Ethisphere for another year. And my colleague Robin Brown is here. We work hard at this, and Ingredion, as you know, used to be CPC, Best Foods, Corn Products. We bought a company called National Starch 8 years ago and then rebranded as Ingredion. And the whole message around that is bringing two cultures together, which I'll mention in a moment. Before that, before Ingredion, I was actually working in Europe and France for a French company, Péchenet, in the packaging business that was owned by Alcan, that was bought by Rio Tinto, and before that, 17 years at Tenneco. So I have a lot of global experience, and I have to say that I've seen changes happen over the past 30 plus years, and it's been very exciting. For me, I was able to watch the changes because I've actually been on 8 corporate boards, and 5 of them, I was the first female. And some of them were consumer products, Zenith Electronics, Outboard Marine, Sunstrand, and then more recently, I was on the board of A.J. Gallagher, who introduced to me Ethisphere. So I have to thank my board experience for that. And I said, it's a message about building excellence in organizations the right way. And so I've taken that learning, and since then, right now, as I said, I'm chairman of Ingredion. I'm the presiding director of International Paper, just came from a board meeting there and talked about these issues. So it's very current, everything that we're talking about here. And I'm also on the board of Lockheed Martin, which also has a female CEO, very diverse company. So very happy to be here, and we'll get into the issues.
Excellent. So I'll open it up with a question that it's for anyone. You can grab it and take it where you will. I think that we say diversity and inclusion, and we say it quickly in the multitudes and the complexities and the intersectionality of what that means within an organization is complex. And one of the first questions that often comes up at the board level, at the C-suite, is, well, if we're going to do something, how are we going to measure it? How do we define success? What are the KPIs? What does a winning look like? If it's a moving target, what are the milestones that at least indicate that we're progressing? For you all, how do you think, either at the board level, at the executive level, on down, when a new diversity and inclusion program is being rolled out or one is being audited, how do you all think about efficacy, impact, and the measurement of success?
Well, I would say, certainly what you measure is what you manage. And so it's very important to have metrics. And so you can measure your diversity and inclusion numbers at different layers of the organization, different parts of the world. But what I think has made the biggest difference is that as a CEO, I set a goal that every new job, whether internal or external, had to have a diverse slate. Because if you don't have a diverse slate, you'll never get there. And so we started measuring what percentage of the jobs that were being filled had a diverse slate with real candidates. both internal and external. And that measurement has led towards more progress. So I think measurements are important, but you have to pick the right ones and not just numbers, but you're measuring progress.
Who was involved in your case, and who have you seen being involved in what those metrics? Because I agree, what you measure matters a great deal, and measuring the wrong things can lead you down not a good path. So who was involved in the development of those metrics?
Well, certainly, as CEO, I worked with the head of human resources, our head of talent management and diversity and inclusion. But I'm an analytical person. I have 2 degrees from MIT, so I'm always looking at the numbers. And so, but working with the executive leadership team, because it's not just an HR function or a CEO function, you have to have the entire executive team. But the HR organization would give me the score, like who was really living by those goals. And I inched it up from 90% of the roles. I wanted 90% of the roles to have diverse slate for director and above. And then the next year I said, why not 95% for the entire organization around the world? So HR and finance would give me the statistics, and then I could actually talk to those executives to find out why they were lagging. But that type of metric on people's goals really made a difference.
That's great.
Yeah, if I could build on your point, and I agree that the notion of having a diverse slate is extremely critical. As I think about metrics, I like to think about them as a continuum. And so what you described with a diverse slate is a process metric, right? So we're going to have a diverse slate, and that's something we can measure, whether our process is effective and whether we're sticking with it and complying with it. Beyond that, though, there are also behavioral metrics. Are people acting differently? And you can measure that by 360s and multi-raters. You also have outcome metrics. You talked about representation and counting heads and the things that you can count in an organization. Ultimately, I think what matters most are perception metrics, because perception is reality. Perception is reality for your employees. So what are they thinking about the culture of the organization? Is it a culture that they're willing to promote? Is it a culture that they're committing to stay in and contribute in? The perception of your customers, whether they're commercial customers or consumers, is a perception metric that gives you feedback on how you're doing from an inclusion standpoint. And to really build a scorecard that has metrics across those dimensions, I think, can be particularly compelling. And then finally, having metrics that are as closely linked to your business ambitions is another driving force to make this whole topic stick.
And how, for the MBA specifically on that last point, how does that tie in with the business goals of the MBA?
Yeah, so our pillar for our business pillar that is most closely connected, because it's a core value. Diversity and inclusion are core values for us, but I think our business pillar that is most tightly coupled with our efforts around diversity and inclusion is innovation. And so we are quite directly measuring our level of innovation in terms of the number of projects, in terms of the contribution of those projects to our growth metrics. And so we firmly believe that diversity and inclusion drive innovation. And so that's really where our connective tissue is.
That's great.
But let's start with the leadership believing that it is a core value. And that is still, there's still a to come in many organizations, including many Fortune 500 companies.
Debbie, I'll come back to you with this question. That's a good segue. Where are we seeing more outside pressure than we did in the past, either from the top down, from the board, or from, we talked about sort of law firms being held accountable for the teams that they put on accounts and the diversity makeup of the teams and sort of restrictions on whether or not a company will do business with a law firm. What types of outside influences have you seen or are you seeing that are influencing and putting pressure on organizations to increase their accountability around diversity and inclusion?
I think the most powerful are the shareholder community and certainly hitting people where it really counts, which is revenue. So customers really matter. And that pressure gets to the core of your business. There can be a lot of people from external, there's a lot of gadflies, et cetera, but at the end of the day, every shareholder cares about their stock price and shareholder return. And so I feel like we get that customer base and the shareholder base connected, that's the maximum pressure you can apply.
You know, I would add that I think companies today see that to be successful, and of course, delivering value to shareholders is the most important metric, but to be successful, you need to have great talent. And there's a lot of competition. And so it just makes good business sense to open up the world. I call it opening up the envelope to great talent at every level of the organization, whether it's at the board, senior management, or down in the organization. And so I think the drive for success and competition around the world for talent is the greatest impetus. I mean, shareholders, of course, you got to do the right things, and ISS and Glass Lewis, but it's really shareholder and creating value that is the most important driving factor, that the time is to do it right and how you're going to find the talent and attract it. And so that is what's, I think, creating the visibility today to really drive this home.
I couldn't agree more. And I just want to share one of the experiences I'm starting to have with employees, or candidates, I should say, for positions at our league. I've got more and more people reaching out to me to ask questions about the culture, particularly people who are of the highest talent, who have options. They're coming in to our organization and saying, I want to make sure that this is a culture where I can succeed, where I can bring my whole self to work. And they're asking lots of penetrating questions about what the work environment's like, far more questions than I asked when I was in the market. And so I think employees and candidates are also going to be putting pressure. I mean, to your point about talent, and they're going to be putting a lot of pressure on us as business leaders to make sure the environment is welcoming and supportive and attractive.
I'd still say that I personally agree with both of you, but I still think it's very early days.
And it
We got
varies
a
by
long way to
industry.
go.
Yeah, we're talking
Varies
about
by industry as
yeah,
well.
some industries, you know, I say like middle America, manufacturing, we get it, we got to be good.
Yeah.
But there are some areas that we've talked about, high tech and media,
Yeah.
that are lagging.
Way behind the times.
My experience at EVERFI, mission-based business, value-based business, I look at the leadership team, I look at the folks who have been attracted to the organization, and a big part of what attracted them is the values. And I had great conversations with Kurt Drake at Kimberly-Clark about, a 150-year-old business that is built on just unwavering values, and what that means to draw in a talent pool that sees that, and having a commitment to inclusion and belonging as part of your organization sends a signal, sends a message that has that as well. So it's an interesting way to think about from the top down how that pulls the type of talent that you want in your organization. So obviously the three of you are committed to diversity and inclusion, and on the boards you sit on, and the positions and the roles you play within corporations. Understanding that one person can't effectuate change, no matter what that position is, how have you thought about bringing in other stakeholders, either above or to your left and to your right? What are sort of methods, or how have you thought about it to get people to support you?
I think it's important in any organization, whatever role you're in, to be the voice. I'm a big believer in the power of one. You don't need a million people around you. I've been a pioneer my whole life. So when I was, whatever level or the organization, I would push for change, but do it the right way, to include my peers, my superiors, people below me. So as CEO, of course, I had the executive team, and they listened very well. As a board member, you got to be careful. The role of the board is to set strategy, support the CEO and the management team, not to lead. So I've been both places. I've been CEO and I've been on chairman of the board, and now I'm on board. So I'm very careful in the board roles to ensure that the CEO and the team are doing the right things and moving in the right direction, but let them lead and set the strategy. So you get whatever room you're in, you can really be the pioneer, you can model the behavior. So when I became CEO of Ingredion, I wanted to increase the diversity of the board. I had a very diverse board. But in order to do that, and today Ingredion has one of the most diverse boards in America with 4 women, 2 Hispanics, 1 African American, and 3 white males. Anyway, it took, though, my leadership with the Nominating Governance Committee and to open the envelope, because to bring on that diversity, it meant looking at requirements, and it wasn't just about gender, it was about culture, it was about thought process, and bringing on board members. We added a board member who is from Colombia, lives in Panama City. Another one lives in Mexico City. There were people from all over the world. But it was a mindset. And so I was able to model that behavior, saying they didn't have to have been a Fortune 500 CEO to be on the board, because I was looking for people who could help make the company successful. So in that way, I was able to model behavior, and then people take the lead from that. But whatever position you're in, you can drive change.
I love that. That's great.
Yeah, I would add that there are really 2 things from my perspective that are essential to getting the most senior leaders involved. And one is defining this topic in its broadest sense. And I think I always ask the question, when you say diverse candidate or diverse employee, what are you really saying? And generally speaking, diverse is a metaphor, is a euphemism for non-white male in that context.
Right.
And so you can't have a conversation about diversity that's exclusive or excluding folks. And so I like to think about the importance of talking about inherent diversity and acquired diversity, and both being important to the conversation in a way that lets everybody be part of that conversation. And so your executives can be a part of that conversation in a very real and material way.
Can you explain
again?
inherent? Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you explain?
Okay. So inherent diversity that, generally speaking, I'm born with. Right? So these are characteristics, demographic characteristics generally. These are things that I can't change, or in some cases are very hard to change. But that's inherent diversity. Acquired diversity is diversity of experience, diversity of your background, the choices you make, how you live your life. Those together, by the way, they inform each other, certainly, but those together, I think, is a way to think about diversity that is inclusive, so that everyone can be part of the conversation. One of the areas of resistance I've found, particularly for those executives that you need to have as part of the conversation, is it's to be included in the conversation, not to feel like whenever you say diversity, you're talking about someone who's not like that.
Right.
So I think that's an important piece. The other piece, in my career, have never, or very rarely, have I had someone say, I want everyone around me to look just like me, to have the same experience, and to agree with everything I say. I've never, there may be one of you who believes that, right? But I've never had anyone say that to me. Everyone gets the whole notion and concept of diversity, I believe. I think that one of the challenges is, though, what do I really do? Like, how do I affect it? How do I, as a leader, as a contributor, as anyone in the organization, what do I really do? And so we're spending a lot of time at our league focusing on what are the things you can do differently, that you need to do differently to really advance the culture. I mean, what are the tools that can make me a better leader, make better decisions, and really crystallizing the conversation into that kind of toolkit and that strategy and that kind of methodology is I think really helpful to help people advance this whole process.
That's great.
I think it would also be helpful, because it would be wonderful if the whole world had your perspective, because I know we share it, and many people in the room. But it would be nice, I think, I shouldn't say nice, I think it's important that shareholders elevate this discussion as well, because at the end of the day, they own our companies, and everyone is laser focused on return, which they should be. But when you look out ahead at the dramatic changes that are happening in all of our customer bases, and the drama we have in the public arena around whether people feel there's a future for them in this country and the world, we may need external nudges as Fortune 500 companies and larger institutions as well, to make sure that the shareholder is well represented by who's sitting around that table. You can't say today that the board table that is not diverse is representing the customer base, not about the future, but today.
Yeah.
And so I think we need to join these perspectives, and it's great when you have a board that's nudging, but at the end of the day, sometimes the CEO needs a nudge, may need a nudge from outside of the board table.
Yeah, that's great. One more question for the group, and then I have some specific questions for each of you. This is a big one. It's recruiting. We'll get into the cultivation of future leaders in a few minutes, but just the notion of designing strategies into your recruiting processes that help foster and build a more diverse organization, perspectives, ideas, challenges, best practices that you all would share on that.
Well, I would start, we're based in Chicago, so it's a great community of talent. And so we all use our methods to attract talent, but what attracts talent the most is being successful. And then, of course, word of mouth and people in the community. And so, of course, we all have a branding strategy, but it's really about delivering value to the community and the shareholders. It really drives the reputation, and then people want to join the company, and then treating people right, people feeling good. So, an example, we rebranded the company. We were Corn Products, and we were competing with Groupon for employees. And Groupon sounded like this millennial startup and very diverse culture, and Corn Products didn't. So we rebranded the company after an acquisition, but it was a message. It wasn't just a new name and new collateral material, but it was a message that we're going to value diversity of thought and process and culture around the world, and then delivering on that and hiring a lot of people from other companies. And it's incredible how you mentioned Kraft, and we were able to attract people from Mondelez, Kraft, Nalco, from around the Chicago community by delivering on the promise of advancing people's careers, creating value in the stock. We more than quadrupled the stock price. And so now today, Ingredion is still building its reputation, but I think by sending that message to the community and then moving people around the world really made a big difference.
That's great.
Yeah, I would say that looking at competencies and really mapping out roles that are based more on true requirements versus preferences. I mean, we have tended to hire people who fit a particular profile. And when you look at the fact that people fit a similar profile and they tend to look alike and have the same kinds of backgrounds and the same kinds of experiences, and you start asking the question about why is this the ideal profile, you realize that some of the background requirements are true requirements, but a lot of them are preferences. And so really taking those roles, particularly the most important roles, and really dissecting them and focusing on what are the real competencies for success allows you to cast a much wider net. So we spend a lot of time doing that. The other thing about job descriptions, this is a little bit more technical and pedestrian perhaps, but one of the things that we recently invested in with software, artificial intelligence software, is actually we run our job descriptions through. And it gives us feedback on whether the language we're using is actually potentially turning off groups of candidates that are taking themselves out of the entire process versus being included and at least being considered. There's some data out there about women's evaluation of opportunities in their sense that they've got to be able to check every box, maybe 100%, 90%, versus men checking far fewer before they feel like they're qualified. So we want to make sure that our job descriptions themselves are, one, based on true requirements, not preferences, and then are designed and articulated in a way that is not only attractive, but it's not turning folks off.
That's great.
And as you're putting it together, that the people that are sitting around the table, that there's a perspective around where the puck is going.
Absolutely.
As opposed to where we are today. Because my nickname at home is Old Lady. My daughter is 13, and when I'm sneaking and listening into the conversations that they're having in the next room, I just can't believe how much different their view of the world is than mine. So it doesn't mean that they're all right and we're all wrong, but it does mean that, it's a challenging thing for a company that is purring as it is and looking forward far enough to make sure that that you're going to be ready for that next generation.
That's great. Horace, to piggyback, we did something interesting where we crowdsourced a diversity and inclusion survey. It was an executive survey, not an employee survey, with just about 50 D&I leaders from around the country, and came up with 15 questions on were they publishing their diversity and inclusion data internally, externally, a host of questions, and what initiatives were these organizations deploying already. And I think we had maybe 450 companies ultimately participate. And by far, the highest ranking initiative that had been implemented successfully already was the language used in the job descriptions of auditing that and really being deliberate about the word choices and to not alienate potential candidates. So it's...
I'm sorry to hear that. I thought we were doing something.
Well, I think it's a good thing. So, Eileen, I'd like to direct a question to you as someone who has worn the CEO hat, has sat on a lot of boards, has been the first female on a lot of boards. From your perspective, and I think we've gotten into this a little bit already, but from your perspective, what is the role of an executive? Because as a CEO, you have a lot of responsibilities, but how do you see your role, and how should the world see the role of a CEO in these conversations?
Yeah, I think it's very important that the CEO take the leadership in everything that is important, have metrics, as I said before. So as a CEO, in this whole area of diversity and inclusion, I was actually very proactive in setting the message to our employees about what's important and how we're going to behave and deliver on that. So as an example, we actually joined what's called the 30% Club, which is either you're at 30% diversity on your board or you aspire to it, and we were at higher than that. I joined an organization called CEOs for Diversity. And there's a lot of different organizations, but my message to everybody was, we have to be sincere about this, because you don't want to just join. And there's a lot of CEOs, I have to say, joining organizations. Oh yeah, I believe in that, but what do they do about it? And that drives me crazy, because I know them well. And I'd say, as you all said before, everybody has good intentions, but if they don't have an action plan with metrics to get there and measure and hold themselves accountable, then it's not going to happen. And so I've always stood for, with the organization as a CEO, to really deliver on our commitments. And I'm very happy to say that my successor is a very committed CEO towards diversity and inclusion. In fact, he actually took over January 1, and he's the executive sponsor of an initiative that we developed in Ingredion called Business Resource Groups. And he's the sponsor of one of the groups for African American, and then he's working through action plans. So we brought in a board member to talk to the group, and everybody was invited, and to get feedback. We've done surveys on diversity and inclusion. Where are we doing well? Where aren't we doing well? And so it's very important for the CEO to be the leader and to stand for that, and then to be accountable and action-oriented, and not just joining initiatives just to put their name in.
That's great. Focusing on gender equality, or gender on a board specifically, understanding that you've been the only woman on a lot of boards, and what's your perspective on your role in that seat, in terms of ideally creating a more diverse board, but also helping lead initiatives that are good for the organization?
You know, I've been thinking about this lately, and I will tell you a funny story. When I first joined my first board, I was the first woman, And I replaced somebody who had passed away, and I literally walked in the first day, and they said, "That's your seat. That's where Ralph used to sit." I said, "Okay." And I proceeded to drive change. But I would say, and this is for a message for this terrific group here, is that, you know, most of the Fortune 500 have one woman on the board, and they think they're done. Not mostly, but many companies do. And you know what? The definition of parity, there is a group here in New York, the 30% Club, that says if you're at 40% diversity, women, people of color, that's kind of parity, and I think that's right. So that when you're the first woman on a board, I mean, it's great, but it's not enough. There have to be 2, 3 minority candidates. You got to push. So if your team thinks that they're doing well, they're not doing well enough. And I've been at meetings where I meet people, and we've been recognized at Ingredion for having a diverse board, but I'm not satisfied. And in fact, the boards that I sit on, the International Paper Board, I was at a meeting the last 2 days, and we have 3 women, 1 person of color, and there's 12 board members. And I've talked to the CEO and chairman about how we're going to drive this. You know, let's use the right opportunities. Because we're a very global company, we have to have diversity of thought. So you're never done. And so I would say that that's what I've learned along the way, that it's great to have a pioneer, and I know on the West Coast they're trying that, but unless you get the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th candidate on the board, then you'll start to feel the parity that you need to achieve.
For many of our organizations, the future leaders are within. The future CEO is somewhere in the organization already, the future vice presidents. As you think, and in this, you know, I would welcome anyone to answer this question, but as you think about the cultivation of a more diverse workforce, so it's not, in the case of a board, you're going to bring in someone from the outside, okay, but in the case of an organization, what do you think we can do as business leaders to help cultivate the talent that's within to ensure that not only retention occurs, but growth occurs?
You know,
Big question.
And I'll start, but training and development is very important. And people say, like, do you train your women? And I always say, you know what? We have to train everybody in the organization and do a very specific skill gap for people. What do I have now? Where do I want to be? And what are the skills I need? And then deliver that, and it's not just sensitivity training on diversity and inclusion, it's real skills. I always tell people, if you're not analytical in today's world, and I'm a big believer in STEM education, take a course on finance for non-finance majors. Everybody can gain from that. So you have to have this skill set and make it clear to the organization that you have to be a learning organization, a continuous improvement. And that's why I go to meetings. I learn something. And in fact, when people go to a meeting, I always say, if you don't walk away with 3 things that you learned that day, it might be a metric, it might be a message, then you didn't really listen. And so always push yourself to learn 3 things from every group that you meet, every organization that you attend, or where you've spent your time.
That's great.
I'm encouraged by the pipeline of these dynamic women that I see in the boards that I'm sitting on that are now popping up to that role, that very senior role where they could be considered for the CEO slot. And for sure, they're not there right now, but I do see we get a chance to see the progression in our visits to other locations and people that are presenting before the board. And I think it's a very dynamic group. Now, what the support that they need beyond the technical aspects of their jobs to understanding what it means to transition to that very top rung, the politics of that and the governance issues of that is a whole different, it's a complementary set of skills that I think we ought to be engaged in to make sure that they've got that covered as well. But in terms of the ladies that have their technical chops that are prepared to go to that next level, I feel pretty encouraged in all the boards that I'm on.
You both referenced development and training, and I think that's essential. And certainly, to your question about how do you, what kind of focus do you have on the folks that are within your organization, I think one of the greatest challenges I've experienced is the idea that we're going to get comfortable doing something different for this particular group of associates or employees than we are for this. Everyone gets training, but the needs of this group may be different. And in a way, I've often brought that to life in conversations, is just to ask the question, just use the metaphor of two airplane pilots that are leaving from opposite.
This is my next question for you.
Okay, I think about an airplane pilot that's leaving from JFK and going to LAX. And you've got an airplane pilot leaving at the same time from LAX heading to JFK. And I ask the question, who's going to arrive first? Which pilot, they leave at the same time, they're traveling the same distance, but which one's going to arrive first? And, invariably you think about it, but it's the pilot that's traveling east from LAX is generally going to arrive first because they've got what? What do they have? They have tailwinds. The other pilot has what? Okay, so the question is, which pilot is better? And so that's a question I ask of executives, and helping them see these invisible forces, in this case headwinds and tailwinds, that are helping certain groups of individuals in a company that fit that particular profile or fit the culture in a very direct way, and really they're tailwinds that accelerate their performance and their acceptance and ultimately their advancement, versus others, often they are women or people of color, or they are different in some other way. They're facing headwinds, and they're invisible, but they are insidious. And so being able to understand what those headwinds are, and then develop trainings and responses and interventions that mitigate them. And sponsorship.
To make sure that when they hit those bumps, or that they get a heads up, that there's something there that they aren't even aware of.
Right.
Because that invisible and then very visible support is critical for all of us in our careers. We've had somebody who's tapped us on the shoulder and said, hey, this job is coming up. You need to be focused on that. Or that person is not in your corner. You need to think about whether this is the right slot for you right now, or you need to move off of that. So we all need that sponsorship and encouragement to make sure that we have that informal support and guidance to get to the next rung.
Oris, I so love that analogy or that anecdote. I think when you first introduced it to me, you also shared some specific examples, because I think it's at the macro, I think it's easy to understand, and you can take from that, well, we need to make sure that we're meeting people where they are, that we're training people that's contextualized in a way that's addressing, so that we can pull them forward, so that we're not looking at the two pilots and judging them the same way. Mm-hmm. Can you, to the extent you feel comfortable doing so, share one or two examples of where you've seen that play out and how you've addressed it?
Yeah, absolutely. And so you brought the example up of an individual that's technically proficient and performing well technically, but perhaps hasn't at least manifested the professional skills or the present skills or the other things that are maybe more stylistic, that ultimately will be an important part of her performance or his performance and assessment of their performance. And so, I'm reminded of a client situation many years ago where this client, very large global consumer products company, was hiring women who were PhDs, in this case women of color, to come into their R&D departments. And they were doing this year over year, investing heavily in getting the best performance of women that had the best potential for performance from the best universities. And what they were finding is that after 2 years, generally speaking, these women were leaving the organization. Year after year after year. And through some investigation and discovery, it became pretty clear that these women, in particular in this case, they were women of color, they were coming into an environment that they just didn't fit. Culturally, they were not fitting in. And not only weren't they just naturally fitting in on the first day, they also weren't getting the unwritten rules decoded for them. And you talked about sponsorship. They weren't they were finding that sponsorship was not happening naturally, or mentorship even was not happening naturally as it was for some of their other cohorts that were being brought into the organization at the same time. And so we spent an incredible amount of time working with that client on developing a very unique onboarding process that just helped them socialize themselves, not only with the organization, It helped demystify some of the unwritten rules, but it also helped build a much more powerful and compelling initial relationship with their one-up manager. Because people, I mean, we've all heard this notion that people don't leave organizations, they leave people. And so they were coming in and just not really connecting with their one-up or their two-up manager. And so just by focusing very acutely on that onboarding experience, we actually were able to really turn that attrition issue around.
And not to take this in a different direction, but any similar stories of scenarios like that? Because that's very, I think that resonates very deeply, because it's a scenario that we can all imagine.
You know, I agree with that. I think that when I look at my own career and people that I still stay in touch with from 30 years ago, I was bought and sold many times. In fact, I always tell people, if you're being bought up, don't fret, because you could actually be the leader and have the skill set. And the new company may have the mindset that they need you for the leadership. So the example I love to give about that is I worked for, as I said, a French company that was owned by a Canadian company, and the Canadian company bought the French company. The French people were frantic, like, what does this mean? And I said, this is great. This is a global thinker based in Montreal, and there'll be opportunity for everybody. So I think that you got to look at your own skills and the way they brought us on. So when you talk about onboarding, when you buy a company, the way you onboard the new company is a wonderful message. What happens in the first 48 hours? You know, I've had people say, well, we're going to have an envelope of benefits on everybody's desk. Oh, great. Okay, that's good. But I will tell you that when Corn Products bought National Starch, I took my whole team, I said, we're going to go to New Jersey for dinner tomorrow night within 24 hours. And we're going to embrace everybody because we want them to feel that we need them as part of the future. That was an onboarding. So it's not just new employees, it's a whole set of employees. And so that's my example where it made all the difference. And the new CEO of Ingredion came from that acquisition. So, and they all stayed, that whole team stayed beyond the 2 years, which is the norm for acquisition. So it's how you make people feel part, and it's not just our way or the highway. It's right. The company needs to evolve. Millennials, you know, they have different wants and needs, and so you have to change. I mean, flexible benefits. People have evolved their organizations to really take account for how the workforce has been changing. So what was important to us 30 years ago is different than what's important to the new generation. And I have millennial kids, so I am reminded all the time. Another example I love to say is like what's important to your organization. We used to subsidize the candy machines. We thought we were doing great. The millennials said, no, we don't want to eat that. So we got rid of the vending machines and started subsidizing fresh fruit. Made all the difference, but it was a message. And our company was a food business, so healthy eating, healthy food is a message, and it was important. And so new employees would come in, oh, you're an Ethisphere company, oh, you subsidize and serve fresh fruit. That's all the messages to new employees. So it's not just a training, but it's how you treat people.
That's great. Boris, you were the first Chief Diversity Officer at the MBA. Curious what the impetus was behind that. I can guess, but would love to hear it. And what the goals were that you set out with the leadership team early on, and how you measured against those.
Yeah, I'd start out by saying I've been a fan of the NBA for just about all my life, and I always viewed them as a progressive organization, as a progressive league, and certainly they have and have had that reputation for some time. And certainly when I showed up over 2.5 years ago, I found an organization for whom diversity and inclusion really were core values. But it was an organization that really didn't have, at that time, a formal strategy or infrastructure to support this topic and to make it a sustainable part of how we do business. And so the initial objective was to create that infrastructure and create a compelling story and reason for why this is so important, and ultimately to build strategies in support of that. The way I would frame our journey, not only then, but quite frankly now, is, I think we might have had a diversity reflex, when I joined. And and our objective is to build an inclusion instinct. All right, so to go from being reactive to being much more proactive and thinking inclusion in everything we do, how we evaluate and select talent, how we make decisions about our fans, how we innovate, how we build teams to innovate, and so on. And so that's really been our mission. First, to establish a framework not only that would work at the league office, but that our teams could take and advance within their own organizations, and metrics, and we created a Global Inclusion Council. You know, all of those were the table stakes just to get this process going. But now it's much more about moving the needle. It's about changing behaviors. It's about linking this to not only what we do, but how we do it. And the last thing I'll say is success for me, and I think for us, is that diversity and inclusion is not something else that you do. If you're a leader, it's not an extra thing I've got to think about in my charter, in my work program. It's instinct. It's just how
instinct.
I do what I do. And so that's really the mission we're on.
Yeah, I like that turn of phrase, inclusion instinct, because that's where you know that when the doors close and people are in meetings and people are out in the field, and we have massive global organizations, we're not micromanaging to diversity and inclusion. It has to be something it's inherent.
Absolutely.
Debbie, this question is so well crafted, I'm going to read it because I don't want to miss the words. It's a really, I think, Kevin, you drafted this. It's a really good question, forgive me for reading. How does the board collectively or through specific committees like nominating and governance work to advance diversity so that the entire organization has a similar charter when it comes to diversity?
Well, if I'm interpreting that correctly, that the board should reflect the rest of the organization, and I would add, reflect the world that we live in. So your customer base, your team, and your broader goals that go beyond the borders of your organization. And I think most companies, however they describe that, have moved. I think about the first board I joined, which was probably 15 years ago now. People didn't even use these words back then. So I think it has been a remarkable transition, let's say, over the last 15 years, where not just the companies that I'm on, but most Fortune 500 companies are having this conversation and moving the needle. When we get there, hopefully we'll recognize it when we get there. We're not there yet, but I think has been, board service used to be one of those kind of hallowed things where you had to know somebody from the golf course.
Yeah.
To even be considered. And I think if you look at this audience, as well as the people up here, you can tell that we're very much in a transition that's not complete, but I actually feel pretty optimistic about where we're going. And the last thing I say about it is this generation behind us is fierce. I mean, they know their power in terms of being consumers, and with the way technology has moved, you hear right away when they're happy or unhappy. And so I think that all is very good news for our organizations. Our companies will be responding to very smart and very vocal customers going forward. And I have every confidence that the complexion and the perspective of people on boards is going to get even better with this generation that's coming behind us.
That's great. In the last minute or so that we have, this audience is general counsel, it's chief compliance officers, it's high-ranking folks within large global organizations. Any sage words of advice to leave on for these folks as they go back to their organizations, thinking about ways to address diversity and inclusion more holistically, more globally?
You know, what I would say, and I agree with Debbie, that in the end, I'm optimistic. In other words, we've made progress. I'm a frustrated person. It's never enough. But I think that if you come from this meeting and go back to your organizations, you can say, I've learned a lot. I have some terrific people, and here are the three things that I think that we could do better. It's not that things are broken, but we could do better. We could have metrics. We could add more diversity to the board. It's a great signal. We could mentor between the board and leadership team the right behaviors. And it can be done, like, why don't we have one board member and one executive, ask everybody to have lunch together separately, and you could the subject could be talked about, how we're doing. So think about actions that will make a difference, and they can be small, but it'll be the beginning of a conversation, and that's how I think you drive change. Change takes a while. We're all impatient, but if it moves in the right direction, then I think that we're doing well. And so, as I said, I've seen a lot of change. It's not going to be the perfect world tomorrow, but we got to continue to make progress.
That's great.
I'd also say I have a very good relationship with the general counsels and the corporate secretaries. I'm sure we can all say that. And that's a wonderful conduit for the view of the board, so to speak. Those folks are very smart and very connected in ways that are different than us. And if they hear a message from us that they can carry back wherever is the right place in their organization, sometimes that's a great way to send a message without having a direct conversation with the CEO. So you guys are in very good positions to build relationships with your board, and sometimes there's a message that goes from you to your organization. Sometimes it's delivered via us, but make sure that you cultivate those relationships, because that conduit of information both ways, it can go both ways, and can, I think, help to carry a message from the right point of view and hearing it from the right individual. Sometimes it's at dinner, sometimes it's at lunch. It doesn't have to be as a part of a formal discussion at the board, but that's how human beings transfer information that can change minds and can change decisions. So use your power and use both formal and informal to push your organizations forward.
That's great. Horace?
My guidance would be targeting those organizations for whom their diversity journey is perhaps just starting or somewhat immature. And I would just suggest that you consider, I think the music's
Yeah,
playing.
that's there. It's like we got to get off.
I would just suggest that you consider focusing on inclusion and making the language of your work around inclusion versus diversity. Diversity is such a loaded term and has lots of complexity to it. And I think you can get people to rally around the notion of inclusion. Everyone gets that.
Yeah.
And that may be a way to build some momentum and some traction and to really let diversity come up behind that.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank our panelists. I hope this was valuable to all of you. And thank you to Ethics Chair Kevin. Appreciate it. Thank you so much.